So good to be here. My name is David Yeager. I'm a former middle school teacher. One kind of motivating question for me related to the idea that so often when I was a teacher, I worked so hard on crafting the instructional tasks, as I should. But I often struggled to create an environment where students felt safe completely putting themselves on the line. Being at the frontiers of their abilities, being willing to take intellectual risks to engage with that work. And so the kind of core thrust in at least my work in education involves scenarios like this. So think back being a ninth grader, you may have just loved school, or you may have had all things go your way. Lots of students, though, have lots of struggles. They really try to find out where they are, where they fit in. And one way in which they navigate high school life is in their decisions about tasks to complete or not. So imagine you're a ninth grader and you have an extra credit task you're given by your math teacher. It's clear that there's a way of doing it or a version of the task or a subset of problems where you're going to get an easy A, but you're not going to learn anything new. Or on that task, it's possible that you could get a lower grade, but you might learn a lot. And we have lots of opportunities like this in how we do our homework, how we do our projects. In a national survey, we asked this question. This is brand new data that we received yesterday. Guess what % of American ninth graders chose this option? You have to actually say your guess, or otherwise when you see the data, it won't be. Okay. So it's 63%. A lot of you guessed higher than this, so you're less optimistic than I am. It's 37% on this side. This poses kind of a problem for many of the models that we think about in improving education. We think about increasing rigor, increasing access to learning opportunities. But the idea that kind of we often focus on is that accompanying that more rigorous content, it's also important to create a motivational environment, a social environment in which students feel safe, embracing that, and they choose the hard work on purpose when they don't have to, right? There's a lot of social psychological work on things that predict students' willingness to engage in challenges. I'll only talk about two. One is Carol Dweck's idea of a growth mindset. These are kind of popular summaries of these ideas. I'm not trying to be specific about the psychology here. But this is the idea that smartness is not a fixed entity. It's something that has the potential to grow and develop under the right conditions with the right support. Another learning mindset is what we've called a purpose for learning. Much of this work done here at Stanford. And this is the idea that if you work hard and learn in school, it allows you to gain skills that you can use to have a positive effect on the world around you and also have an enjoyable, fulfilling life. That feels like a platitude, but when you survey lots of kids about why adults want them to work hard, they say, get A's to get jobs to make money. So the strong lay theory is not this, even though this idea of wanting to make a difference is readily accessible to young people, and they can be persuaded to adopt it. Both of these mindsets in randomized experiments, when we invite adolescents to reflect on ways in which these mindsets might be more true for them in their learning context, they tend to feel more comfortable embracing challenges and doing well. I'll just show one of these randomized experiments that really launched my concern about the use of these mindsets at scale and the potential for them as well. This was a study I did my first semester as a professor at UT. The way universities often work is as soon as they find out a place like Stanford is doing something, then they want to copy it. So they heard Stanford was doing an intervention with their incoming freshman class, so UT asked if I could do that. And what we did, we didn't even try hard to make it look cool. This is a survey that teaches the idea of a growth mindset. This is just an image copied into a Qualtrics survey. On the PreOrientation website, this is me logged in. There's a bunch of requirements. Here, students completed their meningitis vaccine, and here they completed the University of Texas Honor Code, and here they took the UT mindset. And it says, click here to learn about social and academic life at UT from current sophomores, juniors, and seniors, et cetera. They click, it takes them to a link. It takes about 25 minutes to complete that exercise where they read the article and they write about how it's relevant to their lives. For me, this was just a replication, a proof of concept. Prior to this, all growth mindset experiments had evolved about 15 to 20 participants per cell. Here, we're going to do this experiment with 8,000 incoming freshmen at UT. The y-axis here is the percent of students who maintained full-time enrollment the first semester at UT. These students are now seniors. We're going to pull the data and see what happens. We don't know. In historical data, when no students received a treatment, what we're going to look at here is achievement gaps, inequalities between continuing gen white and Asian students and first gen white and Asian students, as well as African American and Latino. These students performed relatively similarly, controlling for SAT and GPA. In the historical data, 81% were full-time students as compared to 90%, so there's an achievement gap. In the randomized control group, which over the summer, before entering UT, they learned about how Austin is super cool, you should get a bike, check out the music scene, things that universities do thinking they're orienting you to the college, but actually convey no psychological information. There's no change over time. This is not a statistically significant difference. 75% of students received some version of that mindset treatment I showed you. For those students, 86% were full-time students at the end of the term. 2013, the university didn't implement the mindset treatment at all, but they did increase admission standards and added student support programs. There, it looks just like the 2011 data. In all of these cases, it's 90% across the board for more advantaged students. 2014, all the students received the treatment. Here, the response rate is 95%. Here, the response rate is 95%. And there, we see, in the non-randomized comparison, an increase up to 84%. 2015, they again didn't answer emails, and so no one got it here. And then there, the numbers go back down to 81%. So what we see is, in a randomized treatment, a modest but statistically significant increase in the proportion of students who maintain full-time enrollment by learning before college that if you struggle in your initial classes, it doesn't mean you're dumb, it means you're learning. And it slows the conclusion that you don't belong, you're not smart enough to be here. It doesn't eliminate inequalities, and it doesn't take students up to 100%. We haven't done anything to change teachers, and teachers are almost surely teaching the message that if you don't get an easy A in calculus, you're in the wrong major. So there's a lot more work to be done, but for me, this was a true null rejection hypothesis. We just simply wanted to know if exposure to these mindset ideas could change objective behavior with no attrition, looking at college registrars. I would say Barbara Schneider just replicated this at Michigan State, and we have effects at a number of other colleges as well. So this has led to a great deal of enthusiasm for mindset ideas. And I'll just preface all this by saying that the ideal way to, in my opinion, the ideal way to take this research is to say, if you can have this kind of effect by directly giving students a new lens, how much more inequality might we reduce if we alter the environments that students are entering? Another major consideration is this is a within-institution achievement gap. This is not a between-institution achievement gap. And we saw lots of data yesterday that talk about the differential sorting of students into different institutions, right? And so, so some of my thinking about just taking these direct-to-student interventions is to say, if we want to try to address, use this tool as a method to reduce maybe a portion of some types of academic underachievement, and we wanted to scale this or other things like it, then we need a method of taking we weren't really trying hard to make it great versions of materials and make them suitable for instance, a population like all ninth graders in America. Okay, so first thing I'll talk about is an R&D methodology we inspired by work here at Stanford to take initial ideas and make them ready to at least manipulate the psychological idea in a similar way across the population. The second is to understand heterogeneity of effects. And as I mentioned, all the data to date typically has been within institution achievement gaps, not between institution achievement gaps. And we actually know very little about the conditions under which a brief self-administered mindset intervention would cause improvements in achievement. And you might say, how can that be? We have huge sample sizes in some of these studies. In all of the studies, they're non-probability samples. So you've got range restriction, you've got selection bias, and you can't draw generalizable inferences about the moderating conditions for treatment. And last, even if you did have a probability sample and materials that were suitable, you might have problems where only certain types of schools participate in experiments and have kind of uptake. This is a kind of Sesame Street problem where disadvantaged students seem to benefit most from Sesame Street, but most advantaged parents are the only ones who turn it on. And so what can we know about disseminating potentially suitable treatment in a heterogeneous sample? Does it reach students across the performance distribution? So first I'll talk about some pilots, and next I'll talk about something we call the National Mindset Study. And by way of preview, we plan on making that daily data freely available to anyone in IES Predocs. They're a great group to analyze this data. Okay, so problem one is redesigning materials so they're suitable for a broad population. And really, we're going to draw on two different traditions of design. One is really taught here. It's where I learned it at the Stanford Design School, this notion of user-centered design. And the idea is to learn as much as you can as rapidly as you can, not paying too much attention about sample or generalizability, but you're really looking for information that's going to reject the null, that you're on the wrong track, something is a disaster, it needs to change. And to not overdo it to the point where you're not willing to change something because you've fallen in love with your idea. And so, so the idea is kind of rapid testing and experimentation with minimum viable products. And we're just borrowing from software design here, product design. The second is you might have intuitions about what you might change, but you're not sure if those intuitions about what to change are actual improvements. So you can make lots of changes, they may not improve something. And so here we want to draw on the tradition of A/B testing, which is using whatever available data we have, can we randomize people to seemingly minor variations on these messages and see how quickly we can iterate and get to something that we think is better. So we've done this user-centered design process a number of times. It's kind of routine now when we start our intervention studies. Here's screenshots from one of the ones we had at the design school. This is Anders Ericsson from the 10,000 hours rule and Angela Duckworth, and other people kind of fly in. We, lots of post-it notes, and 90% of that is probably just team building. It's not clear how much you get out of that. But eventually you hear someone say something that in any other context would be mundane. But in the moment of trying to understand the crisis of confidence a student might face when they thought they were going to do well on a math problem and then they bombed it, and the ways that they talk about their own lived experience, what I think these days and events do is they help you really zero in on those insights and kind of bake them in to the DNA of a revised intervention. We have students do what is called a journey map. They kind of tell us their life history through high school. What were their moments of crises of confidence? Who were the people that they found supportive? What are the analogies that they drew on as they told themselves that they could do it or not? And then we put lots of bad ideas on a whiteboard that are mostly not going to go anywhere. And then we spend a few months sifting through that, testing different ideas and debriefing. And I won't go through a lot of the changes we made as a result of that. Some of them are mundane, some we think are potentially interesting. But then we also did some randomized experiments. And so with about 3,000 participants, we tested, as I mentioned, really seemingly minor variations. So for instance, before someone receives a mindset treatment, is it worse to tell them this thing you're about to read is probably going to help you do better in school and stay motivated? That's why you should read it. Or is it better to say, here's some facts. Other students who might show up at this school, they're not going to know these. Would you mind explaining these facts to them and helping them understand how they're true? And we always do the latter, but we never tested it directly with these interventions. We found the same growth mindset intervention, no other change except the first page, led to a significantly weaker effect when we instructed students that this was supposed to help them, especially for students who started with the most fixed mindset beliefs. If anything, they became more entrenched. We tested mundane things like which examples should we use. Forever, we've been using this example of rats, that if you put rats in a stimulating cage, their brains get bigger, versus rats in a boring cage. We thought this was a great example. It was cool. Students universally told us that they're not rats. And then we had another one that I loved that was jugglers. They did these great studies of jugglers, that your brain gets, your white matter changes when you learn how to juggle, but only if you keep practicing the hard juggling. And they're like, math isn't juggling. And what happened is, as grown-ups, we see the analogy. And for adolescents, they're not immediately grasping the analogy. And so we did lots of piloting like that. Should you offer adolescents the fixed mindset view, you're either smart or not, and then the growth mindset view, you can grow your intelligence, and then say the first one's bad and the next one's good? And the answer is no. Because by offering two options, students infer that 50% of people think each way. And then they conform to the norm, perceiving that most people think this way. And we have some other experiments on that. So here's the revised intervention. We had some graphic design people. This is the Pertz group here at Stanford, helped on the design. We have a little graphic. Your brain learns when you work hard on your writing and math assignments, and you gain writing and math skills that you can use in the future. And this helps you make a difference for your family, your community, or the world around you. And there's a series of structured, self-administered writing exercises. One is something we call harnessing adolescent injustice. So we asked them to write about something that makes them really pissed off about the world. Turns out 15-year-olds love writing about what's unfair. So that's not hard at all. Everyone can think of something. But then we say, how are you going to change that thing unless you know something? People, if they're doing things that are unjust, they won't roll over. You have to actually have competence to make a difference. We show them pictures of neurons. We have them imagine their brains lighting up in the scanner when you're learning from a mistake. This is content that actually Carol and I had given Michelle Obama's team some language a few years ago for her back-to-school speeches. And so then we actually used that language back in the treatment. We have audio of her reading this. This is a real student from a pilot who wrote a story about Mr. Tremor, who really used learning mindsets in the week. And then this is just the classic bag of tricks of social psychology, what's called saying is believing. So instead of telling teenagers to believe something, we invite them to explain it to future students, how it could be true for them. So the way the study works is students go to the computer lab, or they have laptops in the classroom. They log in with their name. They complete some baseline measures. Then they're randomly assigned on the fly at the student level within classes to treatment or control. And the control looks visually almost identical. Also has some quotes from Michelle Obama, but she's talking about the brain initiative in science, for instance. Quotes from peers, but they're about how the brain works, not about how the brain grows and learns, or about your purpose. Session 2, they come back a few weeks later. They complete the second session of growth mindset plus purpose intervention. Then they complete some initial outcomes measures, the short-term proxies. For the national study, this is all I have for you today, because the school year's not over for this year. But then for the pilot, we also have their grades from the registrar at the end of the term. So here are the results from the pilot from this exact study. We conveniently sampled 10 high schools across the country. We pay a research firm who specializes in public health surveys. So when you want to look at statistics about what proportion of teenagers smoke, that comes from the BRFSS, ICF. The same people who collect those government surveys are the people who we contracted to go to the schools and then conduct this intervention. So from the school's perspective, it's a survey. And from students' perspective, it's a survey about transitioning to high school. And what that allows us to do is to get 95% student response rates within schools. In the pilot, students complete these 2 sessions, and then several months later, we get their registrar data. The primary effect we're going to look at is the percent who earn DF averages in core academic classes, math, science, social studies, and English. And for the main effect in the full population is 4 percentage points. Of course, it's bigger among students who were in danger of failing. But we looked even more as a subset just for this conference to look at inequalities. So for students of color whose parents do not have a college degree and who are attending low to medium PSAT score schools, then in the control group, 39% of freshmen have a DF average across their core classes, which we thought was really high. But that's reduced to 39% for people who got the treatment, self-administered treatment. Now, what the national sampling frame will allow us to do is look at heterogeneity in these effects. These are nice, they're replications, they don't tell us anything about generalizability. So we have something we call the National Mindset Study and a bunch of wonderful collaborators and co-PIs. It's a national probability sample, randomized experiment in 9th grade. Schools are selected from among 12,000 regular US public high schools, which means that their lowest grade was 9th grade, so everyone's beginning 9th grade. More than 50 9th graders, because that would be a small sample size. We didn't want to fly there for that. Non-charter, non-public. And they're stratified by school achievement and racial composition, and I'll explain why this is important. So with that, we selected 138 schools. 76 participated. In addition, we oversampled 7 from HISD, so we have 83 in the sample. Within schools, 93% of students completed the materials, and 94% of math teachers were surveyed. And I'll tell you about the math teacher data at the very end. And so at the end, as I mentioned, student surveys and random assignment to program versus control. So the prediction for the between-site heterogeneity, and we don't have data on this yet, was taken from a Greg Duncan paper of the Goldilocks effect, that for some schools, it's just going to be a disaster. There's just a grenade blows up, and you can't, like nothing, no learning happens in some schools. And that would have been like my classroom my first year teaching. And then in some schools, they're doing everything for you. And so presumably, students won't benefit anymore. But in a large proportion of schools, it's possible to learn, but students are not fully benefiting from the challenges that are being offered. And so in those schools, to the extent that those might be the majority of schools serving low-income students, then the treatment might reduce inequalities by getting these schools. For these schools, students don't need mindset. They need classrooms that are under control. They need safety, nutrition, et cetera. But in these schools, you might get a boost. So, but how do you create this x-axis? So there's, unfortunately, Sean's data is using nationally available data, which ends at 8th grade. So we needed a high school achievement metric. So we contacted greatschools.net. They sent us their data, and then the College Board sent us PSATs, AP scores, and percent taking AP. And because Great Schools scores are standardized within state, then we z-scored within state and then added a NAEP constant averaged over 2011, 2013, and estimated a latent variable. It says school quality. It should say school achievement. The problem, so ideally what you would do if you wanted to estimate the average treatment effect in the country is you would have proportional allocation across strata. So you have a normal distribution in the population of school achievement, then you'd have the normal distribution in your sample. But if you want to test moderation effects, if your interest is in heterogeneity from the start, you wouldn't allocate that way because you have subgroups that look like this. That bar is bigger than that. And so the power to test within that subgroup is really weak. So you would have proportional allocation if you wanted to test interactions or effects within subgroups. So what we tried to do was we did the power analyses and tried to optimally balance between proportional sampling and subgroups. Where it gets tricky, though, is that, as we've been seeing, school achievement is confounded with racial composition. There are no high schools in America with more than 70% minority students who are above the mean for school achievement level. And there are very few that are in this range. The between-school correlation of minority composition, this is Black or Latino, with school achievement is 0.6. And the correlation with free and reduced lunch is 0.5. So what we tried to do was to oversample in this range here. So we could have more schools that are higher achieving but high minority in order to disentangle effects of school resources and school instruction from stereotype threat relevant effects, which might depend more on peer climate, peer culture. So I won't go into this, but we have a compromise that optimizes 80% power given our past treatment effects for three estimands: average treatment effect within each stratum, and then interaction effects between strata. All right, so here are the immediate treatment effects. This data came in yesterday, so my grad students stayed up really late last night. In the nation, the treatment effect reduces the proportion of students who say they have a fixed mindset moments later from 43% in the control to 31% in the treatment. It's also interesting, this is the first time we've ever had a national estimate of percent of students with a fixed mindset, is this control group. So it's 43, which we didn't know previously. The effect size is 0.29 standard deviations. For the self-transcendent purpose, remember we manipulated both. What we find is a modest of 0.13 increase in students saying that their goal is to learn so they can make a difference in the world. This is a composite of a series of items. So we're manipulating both of the independent variables modestly, but I think to a nice extent given the heterogeneity of the sample. Then we want to look at the immediate behavioral steps after the treatment. So that first question I started with, are you willing to choose the hard math problem even you would get a lower grade? Remember, in the control condition, it was 37%. That's increased to 49% in the treatment, effect size of 0.24. And again, these are generalizable average treatment effects for the nation. We then had a behavioral task. We call it the make a worksheet task. The idea is at the end, you can you're going to have to do math problems. And so we tell you some are very challenging, some are somewhat challenging, some are not very challenging. And then these are all from Khan Academy, and they pick how many problems they'd like to do. And what we find is that in the control, they pick way more easy problems than hard problems, and that's reduced in the treatment. So they choose significantly more hard problems in the treatment, significantly fewer. So just to end, let me end with the feasibility of national dissemination. We don't have grades data yet, so I can't tell you whether on a national level the treatment has affected grades. Presumably there will be lots of heterogeneity. What I can say is whether it's possible to give this treatment out in a way that doesn't differentially benefit more advantaged schools, which is a classic problem that treatments that seem really promising, only more advantaged schools have the resources to engage in uptake. And so it could heighten inequality. And so we find that uptake is not related to school achievement level. So non-response, the 40 whatever schools who said no to the study were no different on school achievement levels compared to the schools who said yes. So the decision to participate was unassociated with school achievement, which is nice. Student response rate, so what % of students within the school participated, was unrelated to school quality, except for the 3 outliers at the very end. So consistent with the Goldilocks effect, far on the left, those schools couldn't get their students to the lab, but all the other schools could. And then the treatment effects on that worksheet task were uncorrelated with achievement level. So to summarize, with funding from the Rakes Foundation, we're making this data available. And what we'd like to do is merge it with the data you'll hear about today. At the student level, we have attitudes, behaviors. We have twin data. We have identical fraternal twins. Math teachers, they completed a video-based assessment of pedagogical content knowledge. They took an IQ test, which was kind of tricky to get math teachers to do that. And we have a measure of implicit racial bias against Black and Latinos. So for the first time, we'll be able to look at the effect of teachers' racial bias on sizes of achievement gaps, looking at identical and fraternal twins who have the same and different teachers. And then hopefully we'll merge with the data here. So thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Jason.
Thank you, David. That was great.